The Disappearance of Finch Adderwood. Chapter 1. The Knock. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Finch Adderwood sat cross-legged on the living room floor with a coloring book spread open between her knees, the wax crayons scattered around her like fallen soldiers. She was 8 years old, and she'd already decided that purple was the superior color for drawing horses, and no one in the entire world was going to convince her otherwise. Her mother, June, was in the kitchen. Finch could hear the clatter of pots and the low hum of a song she didn't know the name of. The kitchen light spilled through the doorway in a warm rectangle that cut across the carpet, and Finch kept glancing at it the way she always did when her mother was cooking, half expecting her to appear in the doorway with a wooden spoon and a look of exaggerated seriousness, asking Finch to come taste something. But tonight June didn't appear. Tonight the kitchen sounds kept going, steady and unbroken, and Finch went back to her horse. It was going to be purple with a green mane. She had already decided this. The knock came at 6:47 in the evening. It wasn't the kind of knock you heard every day. It wasn't the postman or the neighbor from down the street or one of Mum's friends popping in unannounced. It was the kind of knock that had weight behind it. 2 sharp raps on the front door, followed by a pause, followed by a third, like someone had rehearsed it. June turned off the stove. The song stopped. Finch looked up from her coloring book. Something had changed in the quality of the air, the way it does when someone in the house goes very still. She heard her mother's footsteps cross the kitchen floor, slower than usual, heavier, and the creak of the hallway floorboard just before the front door. Through the gap beneath the coloring book, Finch could see her mother's feet stop, could see the hem of her blue dress, could see the way she stood there for a long moment without reaching for the handle. "Mrs. Adderwood?" said a voice from the other side of the door. A man's voice, deep and measured and careful in the way that voices are careful when they've been trained to deliver bad news. June opened the door. Finch couldn't see the man's face from where she was sitting, but she could see his shoes, black leather boots, polished to a dull shine, wet from the rain. She could see the bottom edge of a dark blue uniform, and she could see the way her mother's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Mrs. Adderwood, my name is Sergeant Paul O'Brien. I'm from the New South Wales Police Force. May I come in?" What followed was a conversation that Finch would replay in her mind 10,000 times over the next 8 years. She would rearrange the words and try different inflections and search for hidden meanings the way you search for shapes in clouds, but the shape of the conversation never changed. It was always the same. It was always the worst thing she had ever heard. Sergeant O'Brien sat at their kitchen table. June made him a cup of tea because that was what you did. Even when the world was falling apart, you made a cup of tea. Finch sat in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway with her coloring book still clutched to her chest, and she watched the policeman's mouth move. The truck had left the road at high speed on the Pacific Highway, about 40 minutes north of Sydney. It had crossed the median strip and struck a tree, a massive iron bark, at an angle that wrapped the chassis around the trunk like tinfoil. The engine had been pushed into the cabin. There was almost nothing left of the cab. June's face was very white. She held the teacup in both hands, but she wasn't drinking from it. The strangest thing, and Sergeant O'Brien used that word strange, which was the wrong word for what he was about to say, the completely and utterly wrong word, was that there were no remains at the scene. No remains. Truck was destroyed. The driver's side was compressed to a third of its original width. There was blood on the steering column and on the shattered glass of the windshield, but there was no body in the cab, no body on the road, no body in the grass verge or the tree line. The paramedics had arrived within minutes. The police had searched a 2-kilometer radius. The dogs had picked up nothing. Caleb Adderwood had simply ceased to exist. His work ID was still in the glove compartment, Sergeant O'Brien said. His wallet was in his back pocket, the wedding ring. He stopped, looked down at his tea. The wedding ring was on the dashboard. June made a sound that Finch had never heard before. It was a very small sound, almost nothing, but it went through Finch like a nail. The policeman left eventually. The rain kept going. June sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and Finch sat in the doorway, and neither of them moved. Eventually, Finch got up and went to her mother and put her arms around her waist because that was as high as she could reach, and June put her hand on the back of Finch's head and held her there. That was the night Finch Adderwood's father died, except he hadn't. 8 years is a long time when you're young. "8 years took Finch from primary school to high school, from a small body to a tall one, from childhood to whatever awkward thing she was now. 16, long-limbed, with a shock of lavender hair that she'd dyed herself in the bathroom using a kit she'd bought from the chemist. Her mother hated it. Finch loved it. It was the color of the flowers in the garden that Caleb had planted the spring before he disappeared, and some part of her, the part she didn't like to examine too closely, kept it that way on purpose. She was tall, taller than most of the girls in her year, taller than half the boys, with a kind of gangly frame that suggested she might still have some growing left to do. Her face was angular, her jaw defined, her eyes a pale gray blue that people sometimes called silver when the light hit them right. She had her father's eyes, her mother used to say, before she stopped saying much of anything at all. June Adderwood had not handled the years well. She had handled them the way some people handle grief, by becoming smaller. She still went to work, still paid the bills, still made dinner most nights, but the light behind her eyes had gone out and Finch had never seen it come back on. They lived in the same house in Brookvale, on the same street, in the same room Finch had always slept in. Caleb's things were still in the garage, his boots by the back door, his flannel jacket hanging on the hook in the hallway. June couldn't move them. Finch couldn't ask her to. School was school. Finch was not unpopular exactly, but she was not the center of anything either. She had a small orbit of friends, Priya, who was obsessed with marine biology, Ollie, who played guitar badly and enthusiastically, and Tomoko, who was the only person Finch had ever met who read more books than she did. They ate lunch together in the library most days, and they talked about normal things, and Finch was normal, mostly. Sometimes she woke up at 3 in the morning with a feeling she couldn't name, a sense of something unfinished, like a sentence that cut off mid-word. She would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling and feel the shape of her father's absence like a missing tooth, her tongue going back to it again and again. She dreamed about him. Not often, but enough. In the dreams, he was always just out of reach, standing at the end of a long hallway, or sitting in the cab of his truck with the window up, or walking away from her across a field that went on forever. She would call out to him and he would turn, and she would see his face, and then she would wake up. The morning everything changed started like any other. Finch's alarm went off at 6:30. She hit snooze. It went off again at 6:39. She hit snooze again. The third time, she actually opened her eyes. The ceiling was wrong. Not wrong in a dramatic way, not cracked or water-stained or on fire. It was simply a different ceiling. It was flat and white and featureless, and it was very close to her face, much closer than the ceiling in her bedroom, which was a standard 2.4 meters above her bed. This ceiling was maybe a meter away. She could have reached up and touched it. Finch blinked. She was not in her bed. She was lying on something hard and cold, and the sky above her was pale and gray and enormous, and the ceiling she had been looking at was not a ceiling at all. It was the underside of a highway overpass. She sat up. Her head throbbed. Her mouth was dry and tasted like copper. She was lying on asphalt, a road surface that was cracked and buckled, with weeds pushing through the gaps. There were lane markings beneath her, faded yellow lines, and she was lying directly across one of them. To her left, the highway stretched into the distance, empty. To her right, the same. There were no cars, there were no trucks. There was no sound at all except the wind, which moved through the empty air with a low, mournful quality, as though it had been blowing like this for a very long time and expected to go on blowing forever. Finch got to her feet. She was wearing what she'd gone to bed in, an oversized t-shirt with a faded print of a band she no longer listened to, cotton pajama shorts, and no shoes. Her feet were cold on the asphalt. Her lavender hair was tangled and matted on one side from sleep. The overpass she was beneath spanned a two-lane road that ran perpendicular to the highway. On either side of the road, the land was overgrown, long grass, scrubby bushes, the skeletal remains of a fence. In the distance, she could see buildings, or what was left of them. Finch turned in a slow circle. The highway was littered with abandoned vehicles, cars, trucks, a bus. All of them stopped at random angles, some with their doors open, some with their windows shattered. None of them looked recently abandoned. Rust had settled on the exposed metal. Vegetation had begun to reclaim the tires. One car, a white sedan, had a tree growing through its engine bay, the trunk pushing up through the hood like a fist through paper. "What the fuck?" Finch whispered. She said it quietly, almost conversationally, as though she were commenting on the weather. Because what else do you say when you go to sleep in your bedroom in Brookvale and wake up on an empty highway with the world apparently ended? Her first thought was that she was dreaming. Her second thought was that she was hallucinating. Her third thought, the one that came in cold and clear and stayed, was that something had happened, something enormous and terrible and completely beyond her understanding. She looked at the sky. It was overcast, the clouds low and gray, and there was a faint smell in the air that she couldn't immediately identify. It took her a moment. It was the smell of decay, not the sharp, fresh smell of something recently dead, but the deep, pervasive odor of organic matter breaking down over a long period of time. Everything smelled like that. The grass, the trees, the air itself. Finch began to walk. She chose a direction toward the buildings she could see in the distance, because staying in one place felt wrong, instinctively wrong, the way standing still feels wrong when you hear a noise in the dark. Her bare feet hurt on the rough asphalt. She picked her way between the abandoned cars, glancing into them as she passed. A child's car seat in the back of a minivan, a phone on the dashboard of a sedan, its screen cracked, a pair of sunglasses hanging from the rearview mirror of a ute. She found a pair of thongs, flip-flops if you were from anywhere else, in the footwell of one of the cars. They were a size too big, but they were better than nothing. She slipped them on and kept walking. The buildings resolved themselves as she got closer. A service station with its pumps ripped out and its windows dark. A fast food restaurant with its sign hanging by one bolt. A motel, the kind of low, sprawling, single-story affair that catered to truck drivers, with every one of its doors hanging open like rows of empty mouths. There was no one in any of them. Finch stood in the car park of the service station and looked at the devastation around her and tried to make her brain work properly. The world hadn't just ended. It had ended a long time ago. Months, maybe years. The vegetation growth alone told her that. The decay. The way nature was slowly, patiently dismantling everything that humans had built. She didn't cry. She wanted to. She could feel the crying sitting in her chest like a stone, but it wouldn't come, and she was almost grateful for that because if she started, she didn't think she would be able to stop. Instead, she looked for supplies. The service station was mostly stripped. The shelves behind the counter had been emptied long ago. No food, no water, no batteries, nothing. But in a storeroom at the back, behind a door that had been kicked in, she found a backpack. It was a gray hiking pack, dusty but functional, with both straps intact. She also found a water bottle, stainless steel, reusable, and a first aid kit that had been half used but still contained bandages, antiseptic, and a packet of paracetamol. She filled the water bottle from a tap that impossibly still worked. She turned the handle and water came out, brown at first and then clear, and she put everything in the backpack and slung it over her shoulders. The motel yielded more, a hoodie, dark blue, too large, which meant it was perfect. A pair of trainers that were close enough to her size. A kitchen knife from what had apparently been someone's room, still sitting on the nightstand next to a stack of moldering paperback books. She took the knife. She took a torch that still worked, the beam flickering but present. She took a tin of baked beans and a can opener from a miniature kitchen in one of the rooms, and she sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like mildew and ate the beans cold with the back of a spoon and tried not to think about where all the people had gone. She had been walking for about 3 hours when she heard the sound. It was a groan, low and guttural and sustained, like someone in terrible pain. It came from somewhere ahead of her, beyond the shell of a building that might have been a warehouse. Finch stopped. Her hand went to the knife at her belt. She'd fashioned a belt from a strip of fabric and looped it through the handle. The groan came again, and then another one joined it, and another. Finch moved toward the sound, slowly, keeping close to the wall of the warehouse. She reached the corner and looked around it and saw them. There were 3 of them. They had been people once. That much was obvious. They had the same basic shape: 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture. But whatever they were now, they were not people anymore. Their skin was a grayish color, pulled tight over their bones in some places and hanging loose in others. Their clothes, what was left of them, Wacken, were torn and stained with substances Finch didn't want to identify. Their eyes were open, but they didn't seem to see. They stood in the middle of the road, swaying slightly, making those low, continuous groaning sounds. Finch's stomach turned. Her heart rate doubled. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run, but she didn't run. She stood very still and watched them. One of them turned its head. Not quickly. Nothing about them was quick. It turned its head the way a clock turns, slow and mechanical, and its milky eyes found the corner of the building where Finch was standing, and it groaned louder and it began to move toward her. Finch ran. She ran harder than she had ever run in her life, the backpack bouncing against her spine, the thongs slapping against her heels, the knife banging against her hip. Behind her, she could hear them, not running. They didn't seem capable of running, but shuffling, dragging themselves forward with a horrible, relentless persistence. She ran until she couldn't hear them anymore. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached and the buildings had given way to open country. Then she stopped, bent double, hands on her knees, and gasped for air. And that was when she heard the voice. "Hey! Hey, don't move! Stay right where you are." A man, younger than she expected. He was standing on a rise about 50 meters ahead of her, backlit by the gray sky. He had something in his hands, a weapon of some kind. He was watching her with the kind of intense focus that comes from years of having to decide very quickly whether someone was a threat. Finch raised her hand slowly. "I'm not," she started. Her voice came out cracked and dry. "I'm not one of them." The man didn't lower his weapon. "How long you been out here?" "I don't know. I woke up on the highway. I don't know what happened. I don't know what any of this is." The man stared at her for a long moment. Then he lowered the weapon, a crossbow, she realized, a compact, modern-looking thing, and took a few steps closer. He was maybe 25, lean and sun-darkened, with close-cropped hair and a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw. "You don't know," he repeated. Not a question. "No." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he did something strange. He laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh or a hysterical one. It was the laugh of a man who had seen enough strange things in the world that one more didn't even register on his scale anymore. "All right," he said. "All right, come with me. My name's Liam, and you mate have got one hell of a story ahead of you." Chapter 2. Hollows. They walked east, away from the open highway and into the tangled remains of suburbia. Liam moved with the easy, practiced efficiency of someone who had been navigating this landscape for a long time, stepping over debris without looking down, ducking beneath hanging wires, taking turns at intersections that all looked the same to Finch but apparently weren't. He carried the crossbow across his chest and a machete at his hip, and he walked with a slight limp that favored his right leg. He didn't explain the limp. He didn't explain much of anything at first. He just walked, and Finch walked beside him, and the silence between them was thick with everything she needed to know. Eventually, as they picked their way through what had once been a residential street, houses with their doors hanging open, gardens gone to seed, a playground with rusted swings, Liam began to talk. "What year do you think it is?" he asked. Finch blinked. "What?" "Humor me." 2024, it's June, early June. Liam nodded slowly. "It's 2031. The number hit her like cold water. No, that's 7 years. You're telling me I've been asleep for 7 years? Not asleep, not exactly, but yeah, you've missed a bit. He glanced at her sideways. What's the last thing you remember? Finch thought about it. The last thing. The very last thing before waking up on the highway. She had been in bed. It had been night. Her alarm was set for 6:30. She had pulled the covers up and closed her eyes and, "That's it," she said. "I went to sleep. I went to sleep in my bed in Brookvale and I woke up on the highway." Liam stopped walking. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, something between disbelief and a very cautious, very careful kind of hope. "Brookvale," he said. "Brookvale, Sydney." "Yes." Finch, that's 200 kilometers from where I found you." "I don't know how. I don't know any of this. I just—" "Okay." He held up a hand. "Okay, we'll figure it out. But right now I need you to listen to me very carefully, because we're about to go through an area where they tend to congregate, and if you make a sound, they will find us." "Who is they?" Liam looked at her. "You saw them. The ones on the road. The groaning ones." "Yeah, they're called hollows. Nobody knows exactly what to call them, but that's what most people have settled on because that's what they are. Hollow. There's nothing left inside." He told her as they walked. He told her in short, clipped sentences the way you'd relay information to someone who needed it fast and couldn't afford to be gentle. It had started 7 years ago. A virus. Not a natural one. It had been engineered, or at least it had originated in a laboratory. Quantum labs. The name meant nothing to Finch, but Liam said it like a curse word. A biotech company, massive, well-funded, with a campus on the outskirts of Sydney. Nobody knew exactly what they were working on. The official story, the one that had been in the news before the news stopped, was that it was a respiratory illness, an accident, a containment breach. But that wasn't what it actually was. "It wasn't a bug," Liam said. "Not the way you think of a bug. It didn't just make you sick. It got into your brain, rewired you, turned you into something that wasn't you anymore. Something that didn't think, didn't speak, didn't do anything except hunger." "Hunger for what?" "Anything. Everything. Flesh, mostly. They don't eat in the normal sense. They tear, they rip, they consume. But the hunger isn't really about food. It's about, I don't know, spreading, destruction. There's no logic to it, no pattern. They just want. And it spread? Like wildfire. Within a month, Sydney was gone. Within 3 months, the East Coast was gone. Within a year. He stopped, swallowed. Within a year, there was nobody left who wasn't either a hollow or hiding from them. They were passing through a park now, or what had been a park. The grass was waist-high and the trees had grown wild, their branches tangling together overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the gray light. Finch could hear birds, actual birds, alive and singing, and the sound was so incongruous with everything else that it made her chest ache. "How are you still alive?" she asked. Liam smiled. It was a thin smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Luck, mostly, and a healthy respect for the fact that hollows are stupid. They can't open doors, they can't climb, they can't reason. They're attracted to sound and movement, but they can't plan. They're like, imagine a toddler with the strength of a grown man and the moral compass of a blender. And they were people. Yeah, the smile vanished. They were people. They crossed the park and entered another street, and Liam led her to a building that had been a church. The doors were barricaded from the inside with welded steel, and there was a peephole at head height. Liam knocked, a specific pattern, 3 taps and a pause and 2 more, and the door opened a crack. An eye appeared. Then the door opened wider and Liam gestured for Finch to go inside. The church had been converted into a way station, pews pushed against the walls, replaced by sleeping mats and storage crates. A water collection system made from gutters and tarps. A small kitchen area with a gas stove and a stack of propane canisters. It was cramped and dim and it smelled like camphor and dust, and it was the safest place Finch had seen since waking up. There were no other people there, just a space that Liam used, apparently, when he was ranging too far from home to make it back before dark. "Home?" Finch asked. "I'll get to that. Sit down. Eat something." He tossed her a packet of something, dried fruit, the preservative-heavy kind that would outlast the apocalypse, and poured her a cup of water from a jerry can. "You need to understand what's out there before I take you anywhere." He sat across from her, the crossbow propped against the wall beside him, and he talked. The Hollows were the obvious threat. They roamed in groups, packs almost, ranging from a handful to dozens. They were drawn to light, to sound, to the scent of living flesh. During the day, they were sluggish, almost torpid, standing still and groaning in that aimless way. At night, they moved faster. Not fast, not by any normal standard, but fast enough that you didn't want to be caught in the open. "There are worse things than hollows," Liam said. "What could be worse than that?" "People." He told her about the groups, the survivors. They had formed in the early days, banding together for safety, and most of them had been what you'd expect, scared, desperate, trying to help each other. But 7 years was a long time, and 7 years of fear and scarcity did things to people. Some groups had become territorial, aggressive. They fought over resources, over territory, over control. "The 2 big ones around here are the Junkyard and the Black Vultures," Liam said. "The Junkyard is, well, you'll see. They're mostly decent. The Black Vultures are not." He didn't elaborate. He just shook his head in a way that suggested he'd seen things he didn't want to describe. "And then there's Avarice." He said the name differently, with a weight that wasn't there for the other groups. "What's Avarice?" Finch asked. Liam looked at her for a long moment. Something flickered across his face. She couldn't tell if it was fear or anger or both. "Avarice is the reason nobody sleeps at night," he said. Look, most groups, even the bad ones, they steal because they have to. They fight because they have to. Avarice is different. They kill because they want to. They steal because they enjoy it. They're not surviving. They're playing, and they're good at it." "How many of them?" "Nobody knows. They don't stay in one place. They move like a storm. They show up somewhere, tear it apart, and move on. They've got this symbol, an A with a circle around it, burned into everything they touch. Walls, doors, cars, people." Finch felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "And they're out there now?" "They're always out there." Liam stood up and began packing gear into a bag. He moved with the same practiced efficiency as before, checking blades, topping off water containers, testing the tension on his crossbow. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe," he said. "There's a group, the Junkyard I mentioned. They've got walls, they've got people, they've got food. I've traded with them before. They'll take you in." "What about you?" "I'll be around. I range too far to stay anywhere permanent, but I can get you there and I can vouch for you, and that's the best I can do." It wasn't much. It wasn't a home or a family or a world that made sense, but it was something, and right now something was all Finch needed. They left the church as the light was beginning to fade. Liam moved quickly now with an urgency that hadn't been there before, and Finch kept pace without being told twice. The Hollows would be more active soon. They needed to reach the Junkyard before dark. They moved through streets that were dark and silent and vast, the buildings looming on either side like cliffs. Once, Finch saw a shape moving in the shadows between two houses, a hollow shambling aimlessly, its groan a low drone beneath the wind. Liam held up a fist and Finch stopped. They waited. The hollow moved on. They moved again. The city fell away gradually, replaced by industrial sprawl, warehouses, freight yards, a rail yard with trains sitting motionless on their tracks like metal carcasses. The junkyard was ahead. Finch could see it, a sprawling compound of corrugated iron and chain link and concrete, lit from within by the warm glow of fires and lanterns. It looked from a distance like something from a Mad Max movie. Up close, it looked like hope. "We're going to approach the main gate," Liam said. "There'll be guards. They'll be watching us from about 100 meters back. Don't make any sudden moves. Don't touch anything. And whatever you do, don't run." "Who are the guards?" "John and his wife. Good people. Tough but good." They walked toward the gate. Finch could see it now, a heavy iron affair, welded from truck parts, flanked by two towers made of stacked shipping containers. A light shone from the top of the left tower, and she could see a silhouette behind it, watching them approach. "Hold it right there." A voice deep and steady carried across the distance. "Stop where you are and identify yourselves." Liam raised his hands. "It's Liam Cross. I've got a girl with me. She's a survivor. She's not a threat." There was a pause, then the voice again. "Drop your weapons, both of you, on the ground. Step back." Liam looked at Finch. "Do as he says." She pulled the kitchen knife from her belt and set it on the ground. Liam lowered his crossbow and set it beside the machete he'd unstrapped from his hip. They both stepped back. The gate opened a crack and a man stepped through. He was in his 50s, broad-shouldered, with a gray beard and eyes that missed nothing. He had a shotgun cradled in his arms, not pointed at them, but ready. Behind him, a woman appeared, shorter, younger, with dark hair pulled back in a braid and the same watchful eyes. "Liam," he said. "Marta." Chapter 3. The Interview. "John," Liam said. "Marta, this is Finch. She woke up on the highway this morning with nothing. She's not infected. She's not a vulture. She's just a kid who needs help." John looked at Finch. He looked at her for a long time, the way you'd look at an animal that had wandered into your yard and you weren't sure if it was friendly. "Inside," he said finally. "She can leave her stuff at the gate. We'll need to check her." "I'm not leaving my bag," Finch said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice came out. John looked at her again, then very slightly he smiled. "All right then, keep your bag, but you're going to have a conversation with Mara before you go any further." He stepped aside. Marta unbarred the gate, and Finch Adderwood walked into the junkyard. The junkyard was larger than it had appeared from the outside. Beyond the gate, the compound opened up into a sprawling, chaotic, surprisingly organized labyrinth of structures. Shipping containers stacked 2 and 3 high, repurposed into dwellings. Tents and tarp shelters stitched together with wire and hope. Vehicles, cars, trucks, buses, stripped of their useful parts and reassembled into walls, towers, and what appeared to be a communal kitchen. A windmill turned slowly on the roof of the tallest structure, powering something Finch couldn't see. People moved through the spaces between. Not many, maybe 50, she estimated, though it was hard to count in the dim light. They glanced at her as she passed, some with curiosity, some with suspicion, most with the blank, guarded expressions of people who had learned not to invest emotionally in strangers. John led her through a narrow corridor formed by 2 rows of containers and into an open area at the center of the compound. A fire pit dominated the space, ringed by stones and fed by a pile of scrap wood. A few people sat around it warming their hands, their faces lit amber by the flames. They looked up as Finch approached. One of them, a young man maybe 20, began to stand, but John waved him back down. "Wait here," John said. "Mara will come to you." He left. Finch stood alone in the firelight, her backpack hanging from one shoulder, the kitchen knife somewhere in the straps, and she waited. She didn't wait long. Mara emerged from one of the container structures, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she was always on her way somewhere and simply tolerating the spaces in between. She was perhaps 40, with sharp features and dark hair threaded with gray. She wore practical clothes, cargo pants, boots, a dark jacket, and she carried herself with the authority of someone who had earned it rather than been given it. She stopped in front of Finch and looked at her. It was the same kind of look John had given her, but sharper, more comprehensive, like she was reading a book very quickly and deciding whether to keep it. "I'm Mara," she said. "Sit down." There was a log near the fire pit. Finch sat. Mara remained standing, which put her at a height advantage that Finch suspected was deliberate. "Tell me everything," Mara said. "Start from the beginning." So Finch did. She talked for a long time. She talked about the knock at the door when she was 8, the policeman, the truck wrapped around the tree, the 8 years of nothing. She talked about waking up on the highway, the hollows, Liam, the church, the walk to the junkyard. She talked about her mother and her father and her lavender hair and the coloring book with the purple horse, and all of it came out in a rush that she couldn't have stopped if she'd wanted to. Mara didn't interrupt. She didn't ask questions. She just listened, her face unreadable, and when Finch finally ran out of words, she stood in silence and stared at the fire. "So you have no idea what year it is," Mara said finally. "Until today, I thought it was 2024, and you've never heard of quantum labs." "No." "Or avarice." "No. Liam mentioned them on the way here, but I've never—" "You know, most people who show up at this gate come in one of two flavors. Either they've been out there surviving on their own and they're half dead and desperate, or they're running from something and they're terrified. You're neither of those things." Mara paused. "You're something I've never seen before." "I'm telling you the truth." "I believe you. That's the problem." Mara looked at her for another long moment. Then she turned and walked away, and Finch thought for one terrible moment that she was leaving, that the conversation was over and the answer was no and she was going to be sent back out into the dark. But Mara came back. She came back with a bowl of something, rice and vegetables still steaming, and a bottle of water, and she set them on the log next to Finch. "Eat," Mara said. "You can stay tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." Finch ate. She ate because she was starving and because the food was hot and real, and it was the first thing she'd eaten in the new world that wasn't cold beans from a tin. The rice was slightly overcooked, and the vegetables were whatever had been available, and it was the best meal she'd ever had. Mara sat across the fire and watched her eat. Around them, the fire popped and hissed, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked, a real dog, alive, the sound of normalcy in a world that had forgotten it. "You said your father's name was Caleb Adderwood," Mara said. Looked up. "Yeah, Caleb Adderwood. I knew a Caleb once." Words hung in the air like smoke. Finch felt something shift in her chest, a tectonic movement, deep and slow. "You knew a Caleb," she repeated. "Before all this. Before the outbreak. It was a long time ago. Never mind." Mara stood up. "Finish your food. John will show you where you can sleep." She left again. Finch sat by the fire and stared at the flames and thought about her father, which was what she always thought about when someone said his name, which was what she thought about every day, which was what she had never stopped thinking about since the night the policeman came to the door. She finished her food. She found John. He led her to a container that had been converted into a dormitory, a long, narrow space lined with sleeping mats, most of them occupied by sleeping forms. He pointed to an empty mat at the far end. "That's yours. Don't make noise. Some of the kids wake easy." There were children in here. Finch could see them, small shapes under thin blankets, breathing softly in the dark. She set her backpack down next to the mat, keeping the knife close, and lay down on her back and stared at the ceiling. The ceiling was corrugated iron, It was cold and it was hard, and it was the ceiling of a room in a place called the junkyard in a world that had ended, and Finch was 16 years old and a very long way from home. She closed her eyes. She did not expect to sleep. She was wrong. Chapter 4. New Faces. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of overcast that settles over Sydney in winter and refuses to leave. Finch woke to the sound of voices and the clatter of activity, people moving, things being carried, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal from somewhere outside. She sat up. The other mats were empty. Whatever passed for the dawn routine in the junkyard had already begun, and she'd slept through it. She found her way out of the container and into the compound. The air was sharp with smoke from cooking fires and the faintly metallic tang of rain-soaked steel. People moved around her, purposeful, busy, each with somewhere to be and something to do. Nobody paid her much attention. The new person novelty had apparently worn off overnight. She found the communal kitchen, a covered area near the center of the compound with a long table, a few stoves, and a woman behind the counter who looked like she'd been awake since 4 in the morning and was already tired of everyone's questions. "You're the new one," the woman said. Not a question. "Finch. Grab a plate, there's porridge. Eat fast. Mara wants to show you around." The porridge was thick and slightly lumpy and had something in it that might have been dried apple. Finch ate it standing up, leaning against the counter, watching the flow of people through the kitchen. There were maybe 30 or 40 people in total that she could see, ranging from elderly to very young. A handful of children, the youngest maybe 4 or 5, the oldest around 12, sat at one end of the table, eating with the focused intensity of children who had learned that food was not guaranteed. Mara appeared beside her without preamble. "Done?" "Almost." Finch scraped the last of the porridge from the bowl and drank the water that had been set out. "Right. Come with me." The tour was brisk and efficient. Mara walked her through the compound, pointing out key locations the way you'd point out fire exits in a building. The water system, rainwater collection filtered through sand and charcoal. The food stores, mostly preserved and dried goods, supplemented by whatever could be scavenged on runs. The medical area in a container with a surprising amount of supplies, organized with military precision. The workshop, where a man named Greg was rebuilding an engine and where another person was sharpening blades on a grinding wheel. "The wall perimeter is patrolled around the clock," Mara said. 2-person shifts, 4-hour rotations. Everyone pulls their weight here. You work, you eat. You don't work, you leave. "What can I do?" Finch asked. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Mara stopped walking and turned to face her. "You're 16. You've got no survival training, no combat experience, no useful skills for the world as it currently exists. Don't look at me like that. I'm not being cruel. I'm being honest. Most people who show up here, even adults, are useless for the first few weeks." "That doesn't mean I can't learn." "No, it doesn't." A flicker of something crossed Mara's face. Not quite a smile, but a softening. "Liam said you held yourself together when you found the hollows. Most people scream and run. You watched. I was too scared to run." "Maybe. Or maybe you're someone who thinks before they move. I can work with that." She introduced Finch to people as they walked. Greg in the workshop, who nodded and went back to his engine. An older woman named Pat, who ran the medical area, who looked at Finch's bare feet and the 2 big thongs and immediately went to find her a proper pair of boots. A man named Dave, who handled food logistics and who said, "We could always use another pair of hands in the kitchen," in a way that suggested the kitchen was the least dangerous assignment he could offer. And then there were the kids. They found Finch at the midday meal, the way children find anyone who looks like they might be interesting, with the sudden overwhelming force of a small, curious tide. There were 5 of them ranging in age from about 6 to 12, and they gathered around Finch's table with the unself-conscious boldness of children who had grown up in a world where strangers were either dangerous or irrelevant, and they had already decided Finch was neither. "You've got purple hair," said the oldest, a girl of about 12 with a freckled face and a missing front tooth. "Lavender," Finch corrected. "What's lavender?" "It's a flower." "Never seen one." The girl's name was Reef. The others were Cass, who was 8 and quiet, Bo, who was 7 and not quiet at all, Wren, who was 6 and clung to Reef's arm like a lifeline, and a boy named Spike, who was 11 and who regarded Finch with the suspicious squint of someone who had not yet decided whether she was worth his time. "We're not allowed to go past the wall," Reef explained, as though this were a boring but necessary fact of life, like gravity or homework. "But I've seen the hollows from the watchtower. They're gross." "They are gross," Finch agreed. "Have you killed one?" Spike asked. "No." "Have you seen one?" "Yeah, 3 of them, on the road." "What did you do?" "I ran." Spike made a face that clearly communicated his disappointment in this answer. "I wouldn't run," he said. "I'd fight." "You're 7, Reef said. "Almost 8. "That's the same as 7. It is not—" "Bo, shut up." "Spike, shut up." Everyone shut up. Reef turned back to Finch with the air of someone who had better things to do than referee. "Do you want to see the watchtower?" "Reef, she just got here," Pat said from somewhere behind them. "Let her eat." Reef sighed the sigh of someone burdened by the incompetence of adults, and the 5 of them dispersed, already arguing among themselves about something that may or may not have involved a lizard. Finch watched them go. Something ached in her chest, something warm and sharp at the same time, like a bruise being pressed. The afternoon passed. Finch helped in the kitchen, scrubbing pots and carrying water. She was awkward at it. Everything in this world required a kind of physical knowledge she didn't have, the muscle memory of survival, but she worked hard and didn't complain, and by the end of the day, Dave had upgraded his assessment of her from useless to not entirely useless. She ate dinner with the other survivors around the fire pit. The food was simple, a stew made from dried meat and root vegetables, thick enough to stand a spoon in, but it was hot and it was enough, and the people around her ate with the quiet gratitude of people who had not always had enough. They didn't talk much to her, not out of hostility, more out of the careful, deliberate privacy that comes from living in close quarters with a small group of people. Everyone knew everyone's business, which meant everyone knew the basics about Finch already, and there was no need to ask. After dinner, the fire burned low and people drifted away to their sleeping quarters. Finch stayed. She liked the fire. She liked the way it moved and the way it smelled and the way it made the dark feel smaller. The kids had told her there would be a campfire tonight, a proper one, bigger, with stories. And sure enough, as the evening deepened, the fire pit was restocked and more people gathered, sitting on logs and crates and overturned buckets. Someone brought out a guitar, not Ollie's guitar, not the guitar from her old life, but a battered acoustic with 3 strings, and played something slow and familiar that Finch couldn't quite place. She sat at the edge of the group, her knees drawn up, and for a few minutes she almost forgot the hollows and the empty highway and the world that had ended. Almost felt like a normal teenager at a normal gathering, listening to music by a fire. Then Mara was there. She appeared beside Finch the way she always appeared, suddenly, silently, with the air of someone who had materialized from the shadows specifically because the shadows needed her elsewhere. "Come with me," Mara said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. The leader wants to see you." Finch looked up at her. Mara's face was lit by the firelight, and in the shifting orange glow she looked older than she had in daylight, and more tired, and more like someone who carried the weight of many things and was not always sure she could bear them. "The leader," Finch repeated. "Our leader. Well, you'll see. Come." Finch stood up and followed her. They left the fire pit and crossed the compound, moving through narrow alleys between containers and structures. The junkyard was quieter now, the fires low, the voices hushed. Mara led her to a structure that Finch hadn't noticed before, a tower taller than anything else in the compound, built from welded steel and shipping containers stacked 4 high. A ladder ran up the outside. "Up there," Mara said. "He's waiting." "Who is he?" Mara looked at her. That softening again, the one from the first day, the one that wasn't quite a smile. "Go up and find out." Climbed. The ladder was cold under her hands and the rungs were uneven and the wind picked up as she ascended, tugging at her lavender hair and the edges of her hoodie. She climbed past the first level, the second, the third. At the 4th level, there was a platform, a wide railed lookout that offered a panoramic view of the compound below and the dark, empty landscape beyond. A desk sat on the platform, a simple wooden desk with a chair behind it and a lamp, battery-powered, casting a warm circle of light. There were papers on the desk, maps, a radio, and there was a person sitting in the chair facing away from her, looking out over the dark land. "Come in," the person said. "Don't just stand on the ladder." A man's voice, deep, steady, with a faint rasp that might have been natural or might have been from years of breathing smoke and dust. Finch stepped onto the platform. Her heart was beating very fast, though she didn't know why. Something about this felt momentous, though she couldn't have explained what. The man swiveled the chair around. He was tall. Even sitting, she could tell he was tall. Long-limbed, broad-shouldered, with a kind of frame that spoke of physical work and endurance. His hair was dark, streaked with gray, and his face was weathered and lined in a way that suggested he had aged more than his years should have required. He had a beard, close-trimmed, and his eyes were pale gray-blue, silver in the light. Finch's breath stopped. She knew those eyes. She had seen them every morning in the mirror for 16 years. She had seen them in photographs on the mantelpiece and in dreams that came at 3 in the morning and in the face of the man who had held her at the kitchen table while her mother made tea for a policeman who had just told them he was dead. "Hello, Finch," said Caleb Adderwood. Move. She didn't breathe. She stood on the platform at the top of the watchtower with the wind in her hair and the firelight far below and the dark stretching out in every direction, and she stared at her father. "Dad?" she said.